Order, order. I would like to start this one-off evidence session on the ongoing conflict in Sudan and the humanitarian crisis that is rolling out of that. We're very fortunate today to have three witnesses, all virtual, who are directly responding to what's unfolding. I wonder if each of you could introduce yourself and your organisation before we start on questions. Sibongani, could you introduce yourself and your organisation, please?
Thank you. Good afternoon. My name is Sibongani Kayola, and I'm the country director of Mercy Corps in Sudan. Mercy Corps is an international NGO working in over 40 countries. In Sudan, we are delivering assistance to those most affected by the conflict across 7 states. Our work focuses on providing immediate support to displaced communities, especially through cash assistance, whilst promoting long-term resilience and recovery of communities.
Thank you, Sibongani. I wonder if there's have you got someone with the voice on, sound on in your room? We're getting echo when we're hearing from you. Khalid, I wonder if you could introduce yourself and your organisation, please.
Thank you very much. My name is Khalid Osman. I'm the Deputy Country Director, however, currently acting as the Country Director. With the World Food Programme, we have been operating in Sudan since 1963, addressing the needs of the people of Sudan. Thank you. Over.
Thank you. And Mary Louise, over to you.
Good to be with you. Good afternoon. Mary Louise Eagleton. I'm the Deputy Representative here in Port Sudan for UNICEF Sudan. UNICEF works across all 18 states of Sudan with a three-pronged approach to the current crisis, focusing on hotspots where there's an ongoing conflict, on areas of high displacement in the east and north and south in safer states, and across the board on system preservation for children, Sudan's 24 million children. Thank you.
Thank you. Sibongani, I wonder if you could start by sort of telling us what the current humanitarian situation is in Sudan.
Thank you, Chair. 1 year of relentless fighting in Sudan has created one of the worst humanitarian and hunger emergencies in recent history. In many places across Sudan, we are weeks, not months, away from catastrophe. Nearly 5 million people are living in emergency levels of food insecurity. Approximately 730,000 children are projected to suffer from severe acute malnutrition. They are on the precipice. In North Darfur, recent reports indicate that emergency thresholds for malnutrition have already been breached twice over. Prices of food have skyrocketed across the country, with the cost of the basic food basket in places such as South Kordofan increasing by over 300% in the last year.
Thank you. That's pretty bleak. Khalid, can I turn to you? Is that your experience, and what is it World Food Programme is doing to help?
I think further to what my colleague just stated, it is fair to say that right now, Sudan is on the brink of something even worse. A famine in conflict hotspot areas like Darfur, Kordofan, and even Khartoum. That is when hunger reaches at a level that is hard to even imagine. It is a nightmare scenario, and we have to do everything we can to stop it.
And how close would you say we are to that nightmare?
If access is not permitted, it will be absolutely difficult to even know the conditions of the people in these areas. The biggest obstacles that we're facing right now, the impediments that are facing across the board the humanitarians is access. The inability for the humanitarians to gain access to the citizens who are in dire need who are desperately in need of the humanitarian assistance. So furthermore, as the lean season approaches, a shadow looms large, a shadow of deepening hunger, threatening to engulf even more innocent lives in its unforgiving embrace. During the lean season, where there's already a lot of people struggling to find enough food, the lean season can make things even harder. That is why it is really crucial for us to gain access to these communities to deliver vital humanitarian assistance. Over.
Thank you. Mary Louise, do you want to add to that, and particularly speaking about children?
Yeah, so we estimate 14 million of Sudan's 24 million are in dire need of urgent humanitarian assistance. 4.6 million children have fled their homes with their families. That makes it the largest child displacement crisis in the world, the largest displacement crisis in the world, with almost 9 million people who've fled their homes. That's like the size of a country like Switzerland, completely fleeing, leaving everything behind, losing all of their belongings. Their parents have lost their jobs. They're completely stretched 1 year on beyond all means with no purchasing power, and 18 million children are not in school for the last year. So it's not just an urgent humanitarian crisis where we suspect that thousands more children could lose their lives in the coming months, but it's a generational catastrophe for children. I'm told that that's double the number of children out of school in Sudan. It's double the number of children of school-age population, primary and secondary, in the UK. So the scale of this learning crisis is severe and has the potential to put the future of Sudan at stake.
And the internally displaced people, is that just fleeing conflict, or are there other factors?
So that is fleeing conflict. Those are families and communities who have fled ongoing fighting when the war first erupted in Khartoum and Darfur and Kordofan. But every month those numbers have been growing. So IOM has been tracking those numbers on a weekly basis, and every month they've grown, and we're now at these really startling numbers. So when you look at the combination, and we're talking about a looming famine, it's the combination of it's a conflict-induced famine that will happen. So it's a combination of displacement, mass displacement, of hunger, and of disease outbreaks. And that lethal combination is what sets up a conflict-induced famine going into the lean season. And the disease outbreak part, very, very concerning and related to what Khalid was talking about access, is that before the war, there was fairly good a healthcare system that functioned with a cold chain system on vaccines that did function across all 18 states, and there was over 80% childhood vaccination. Now we're at just over 50%, and in places like Darfur, we're often in under 30% vaccination coverage. So when you've got displacement, you've got families in congested environments, you have poor sanitation, little water, little food. That combination with disease outbreaks and not enough vaccination is very worrying.
Thank you. Pauline?
And before I ask my question, I don't think the visitors can see or hear what's going on because it's not on the television, which is unfair for people who've made the effort to come.
Absolutely. We'll try and get that addressed. Thank you, Pauline.
Right. So could I ask Sibongani about the refugees, because Sudan already hosted 1.1 million refugees before the current conflict, many of them in refugee camps in the east of the country. Can you tell us what impact the conflict is having on those refugees in those refugee camps?
Thank you for that question. Many of the people that Sudan was hosting, the refugees, had fled into Sudan as it offered a safe space. When the outbreak, when the conflict started, these populations had to make a decision to either stay in Sudan or return to their home countries, where they would be unsafe and where they would be further threatened. What we are seeing now is that the situation in the refugee camps, similar to the situation in the IDP sites, is deteriorating as well. And the refugees face many of the same challenges that the Sudanese people, the internally displaced persons are facing. Khartoum was home, as an urban center, was home to a large number of refugees who were in Khartoum seeking economic opportunities and ways to support their families. With the destruction of Khartoum, many of those people have had to return to very fragile places. And when we think of this conflict, we also need to think of it as a regional conflict. So there's the displacement of Sudanese people from Sudan, but also people who are already vulnerable back into situations of additional fragility in their own home countries. And what we're anticipating, or what we're going to see, is really a regional destabilization in the months to come.
Thank you, Chair. Mary Louise, thank you for some of the evidence you've given already, particularly around the vaccination rates. But I wanted to ask you, generally speaking, what is the state of the hospitals just now and other health care facilities across Sudan?
So extremely fragile. In the areas of conflict, there are 70% of the hospitals are not functioning. Across the country, there are 6,000 primary healthcare centers, and we estimate about half of them are operational. But healthcare workers haven't been paid for the most part since the war broke out. And getting supplies, as Khalid mentioned, to these areas of conflict, to these healthcare centers is very, very difficult. We're dealing with sending in, negotiating access for 4 to 6 to 8 trucks at a time, painstaking negotiations when we should be talking about 6,000 trucks, not 6 trucks at a time, to reach the kind of level of need in these areas. So the healthcare system, very, very concerning. Heroic efforts on behalf of the Ministry of Health and the state ministries of health that have technocrats who are working and have been working in healthcare centers for free and around the clock, but very, very, really hanging by a thread across the country, but especially in conflict areas.
Just an additional question to that, has any of the healthcare facilities or the hospitals been targets? I mean, as in military targets, although we obviously hear that never are targets, but as we've seen elsewhere, they often become the case. Has that been similar in Sudan?
So we have seen militarization in hospitals and in health centers. Medical supplies is appealing for armed groups, and as part of the grave violations of children's rights, we do track and monitor attacks on schools and hospitals, and do have credible reports of attacks and use of hospitals and health centers by armed groups in Sudan.
Thank you.
Rosanna.
Thank you so much, everyone. I just wanted to ask, in terms of person power in your hospitals and healthcare facilities, how many of the team, what percentage is made up of people from Sudan themselves, and what percentage are international aid workers, and is it possible to get aid workers in there from aid organisations in the hospitals to work?
So as UNICEF, we work with and specifically on health, with over 30 partners, international NGOs and national NGOs. 70% of them are national NGOs. But the majority of the health workers across the country and in these primary healthcare centers and in hospitals are all Sudanese. Yeah. So there can be an additionality brought from the international community. Many international NGOs doing outstanding work, including MSF, among others, who bring in teams of doctors. But these are they're small in terms of the scale of the crisis and the need on the ground. And so really supporting those Sudanese heroes that have continued is really fundamental.
Sorry, just to add one more thing. So suffice to say, the Sudanese staff themselves, despite working, have got their own family lives, difficulties and insecurities to deal with at the same time.
So you have families who fled, our own staff, Mercy Corps staff, WFP staff, everyone in the same situation. Everyone fled their homes at the onset of the war. We all had our headquarters in Khartoum, in the capital city. Everyone's homes have been looted. People have lost friends, have lost family members, either directly or indirectly from the stress and the trauma of various evacuations. And then where I am right now in Port Sudan, for example, if you go to a gathering site for displaced people, you'll meet teachers, you'll meet doctors, you'll meet healthcare workers, and they're volunteering at local centers, supporting children and supporting families, all while trying to take care of their own children, their own families that are fragmented, and the trauma that they're suffering.
Thank you. Khalid?
Yeah, just if I may add, on the localization aspect of it, I think it's important to note that for most of us, I mean, for WFP, for instance, we're working with nearly 12 local NGOs, and most of the staff of WFP were also a part and parcel of the implementation of the life-saving activities are also our national staff. Further to Mary Louise's comments, it's also worth noting that some of our staff have actually been IDPs themselves, not once, but twice or third times, as the conflict hotspot was shifting from one area to the other, and the latest being the situation in Al Jazeera.
Sibongani?
Just to add on to Khalid and Mary Louise, I brought with me a quote from one of our team members who had to leave their home in Khartoum. And this person says, "Despite the suffering and loss I have endured, I feel stronger than ever, and I am more committed to my mission of supporting those in need." So it's really important for us to honor the unwavering strength and resilience of the Sudanese people in this time. But I also wanted to add that across the INGO community, we have approximately 100 visas that have been pending over the last month. And even where we do receive visas, it takes on average 5 to 6 weeks from the point of application before an approval is given to proceed to an embassy to collect the visa. And given the numbers that we've already spoken about, you can imagine the cost of that 5 to 6 weeks in terms of lives that are lost.
Sadly, we're hearing similar things in other places in the world. Yes, I join you in paying tribute not only to all of your staff and colleagues, but to the Sudanese people. I mean, it's just appalling what's going on right now. Virendra.
Thank you. Khalid, we understand that there is a severe risk of famine across Sudan. Is this your understanding?
Absolutely. The response, the situation of the famine, in order for us to actually be able to verify this, famine has not been officially declared in Sudan, first and foremost. The situation is dire, with millions facing acute food insecurity. WFP struggles to reach 9 out of the 10 people in emergency levels of hunger due to limited access to conflict hotspots. Anecdotal reports suggest people are dying of starvation in areas like Khartoum, Darfur mostly, highlighting the urgency of unrestricted access for humanitarian actors like WFP, UNICEF, and others to assess and address the severity of the food security situation. So in the absence of access, absolutely, this is absolute alarming situation for us because we are unable to reach the communities.
Yes, Shivani. Yes.
In addition to what Khalid has mentioned, we have seen warnings from the Famine Early Warning Systems Network, warning that certain parts of the country will have famine-like conditions in the months to come without an immediate cessation of hostilities and a scale-up of the response. And I would also like to reflect on the fact that this conflict has severely impacted agricultural production in the country. The Food and Agriculture Organization estimated that for 2 staple crops, sorghum and millet, production in the last agricultural year is estimated to be between 24 to 50% below average. And these are the staple crops that we are speaking about. So farmers have been hard hit because they can no longer afford seeds. It's very difficult for them to access their land. It's difficult to access finance. And this has really put pressure on the food systems.
Mary?
Yes, and I think just on famine, it's important to note that, as Sibongani said, the evidence is showing pockets of famine already existing in the country. But we don't wait for famine to be declared and all the data to be in place to be prepared that it's going to happen, because by the time the data is coming out, children are already dying at a very high rate. So that hence the importance of being ready and preventing famine and taking those measures. And as Khalid's talking about, this access issue really critical. We're very, very grateful for the UK and FCDO doubling their pledges at the doubling commitments at the Paris conference last week, and so much more is needed if we're going to be able to prevent famine from happening over the coming weeks and months.
Yes.
Just an additional comment on preventing famine. What we're seeing from organizations that have been able to assess market functionality and the supply of food items in the market indicates that in many places there is some supply of key food and non-food items. However, the biggest constraint is that families cannot afford what is available in the market. So the limiting factor is cash. And cash programming can really provide a lifeline for those in places where the markets are functional, because cash will allow them to access food in the markets. Cash is also fungible, so it can reach people in places where in-kind assistance cannot reach them as rapidly, and it supports the functionality of local markets as well, ensuring that livelihoods are protected.
Khalid, you want to come back?
Yes, I just wanted to add the fact that the humanitarian actors in Sudan have agreed on a famine prevention strategy focusing on 7 million people across 41 hotspot areas. These also include areas that are inaccessible to us, where we are lobbying vigorously to gain access to those citizens and to ensure that they receive the urgent humanitarian aid that they need. Over.
Thank you. Khalid, to what extent can the people across Sudan access safe drinking water?
Allow me to pass that to Mary Louise, if I may. You want to come in, Mary Louise?
Yeah, thank you. No, so even in the best of times, Sudan is very water scarce. And then with the onset of the war, this has just been magnified. We have evidence of also water treatment plants coming under attack. And then as populations are moving to areas and are displaced, they're moving to places with no access to drinking water and to clean water. And that's a big component and proponent of the disease outbreaks. We've had significant cases of cholera in many parts of the country. And we estimate 9 million people in dire need of clean drinking water who have no access to it. I mean, when you go to some of these sites and you see, I was in a healthcare center the other day and a girl was having an epileptic fit, and I went to just get her water in a healthcare center and said, you know, can someone get a cup of water? And it took 10 minutes to find where could there be water. Eventually I had to go to my car and get out a bottle of water to bring it to the girl, because there was no clean water in a health center, not too far from an urban area where we are now. So that's just one indication, but across the country, very, very worrying situation, especially for populations that are displaced and not in host communities where there are existing systems.
Sibongani?
To add on to Mary Louise, I was reading an article yesterday which was chronicling how a dialysis center is no longer able to operate because they cannot access water for dialysis. They cannot power the washing machines, and they reported the number of people who had died, who had been previously receiving treatment at that facility. So a very dire situation.
Khalid?
Yeah, I just wanted to come in and add, picture this. Prior to the conflict, Darfur and the Kordofans really faces the severity of water shortages. In fact, part of the intercommunal violence was as a result of water. And in fact, the significant amount of the malnutrition as well as violence against women was due to water shortage and the inavailability or the scarcity of water. Now imagine with this conflict, further to what Mary Louise said, the situation is absolutely dire. And unfortunately, this is why we're always saying the humanitarian community need immediate access and unimpeded access in order for us to ensure that we deliver the urgent need, the urgent and vital humanitarian assistance.
Mary Louise?
Yeah, and I don't want to give the impression that it's so hopeless that things can't be done. So just to give a little bit on water specifically, in 2023, even despite the war, UNICEF was able to reach 5.9 million people with clean drinking water. And a big part of that is that a lot of the communities in Sudan and the major towns are along the Nile and have these big water treatment plants, but they have come under attack. They've run out of chlorine and basic chemicals to keep running, and we've been very focused on keeping those big water treatment plants going, and also on boreholes and solar systems. So extraordinary how solar pumping systems have just kept going through the war and are sustainable. And so there are these actions we can take. We can reach people at scale with the will behind it to happen and the access.
Thank you. Mary, what impact is the conflict having on women and girls?
Well, unfortunately, like so many conflicts, women and girls bear the highest brunt of the war. As I mentioned earlier, we monitor grave violations against children, but also a part of that is sexual violence. And we have credible reports of over 5,000 grave violations, including significant reports of sexual violence in the country. And then the burden, of course, on girls and women as they're fleeing as primary caregivers. We have the highest, a very, very high rate of maternal and infant mortality in this context. And as Sibongani mentioned, one of the big flagships of supporting women and working on child survival and maternal mortality is cash for these women in pregnancy in healthcare centers to keep them able to feed themselves when they're pregnant, and also for their young children. So sexual violence, a very big concern, as well as social cultural norms and the taboos around that. So in the early days of the conflict, we're now 1 year in, we're seeing babies born from sexual violence and rape. Our team was in Khartoum several weeks ago, and in one of the few remaining hospitals where we were providing support, and very sadly hearing about the children being born from rape now 1 year in, and those women having to abandon, sadly, their children because of the taboos around that. So we're seeing significant increase in unaccompanied children, of abandoned children, and of maternal and infant mortality in this context as well.
Thank you. Thank you, Shirley. Yeah.
In many ways, this conflict has become a war on women. And in addition to what Mary Louise has just said, the economic impact of this conflict has further marginalized women, stripping them of their livelihood opportunities and pushing many of them towards extreme measures and the risk of sexual exploitation as they try to support their families. We have deep concerns from reports of families already resorting to having to marry off younger girls or women engaging in sex for money simply because they need to survive. And the numbers that we have are just the tip of the iceberg because many incidents go unreported due to poor communication, lack of access to services, and community stigma. In a context where sexual and gender-based violence has already destroyed so many lives, it's going to continue to spiral, and we need to see a cessation of hostilities.
Yes, Khalid?
In addition to what my colleagues have stated, it's just worth underlining the fact that women and girls are far more food insecure today than ever. Prior to the conflict, especially in the marginalized communities of the Darfurs and the Kordofans, the 70% of our household families were women. And today, unfortunately, due to the lack of security and protection, but furthermore, it just makes lives very difficult for them and their families. That said, we are the communities that we've targeted even now, majority of the households are led by women. Thanks.
Thank you.
Thank you. I'm calling it a war on women, and then the examples that you've given is pretty harrowing. Thinking about those children that are born through this sexual violence, and you said because of the stigma, a lot of those children are being forced to be given up. What's happening to them? Mary Louise, is that to you?
Yes, so even before the war, there's a cultural taboo of having children out of wedlock. So often when for any reason a child is born out of wedlock, those children are abandoned in the first few days of life. So one of the big things we work on with women's networks and community groups is trying to change this taboo, along with other social cultural norms such as FGM and child marriage that Sibongani also mentioned on the child marriage front. And one of the things is to prevent that abandonment right from the start by supporting pregnant women when they're still in their pregnancy, to have a safe space to give birth and to encourage that bonding very early on with the child in the first few weeks of life, with some support, and then support on livelihoods and a safe place to be in those first months of life, which is so important. But that prevention of abandonment, we were working on before the war on the justice system, also elements that are complex around how women do, how adoption works, and how the laws to support children work. But now with the war, all of those efforts around changing legislation and laws has stopped, has paused, and it's really just firefighting to try to keep these children from being abandoned and to also find foster care and families for them to go to. Early in the war, you may have heard about, there was a big orphanage in Khartoum called Maigoma, where there were over 360 infants that had been abandoned early in life before the war. And so they were almost all under the age of 2, these small children, and 60 died in the first 4 weeks following the onset of the war, because some of the carers had to flee. The supplies weren't getting in, there weren't enough carers, and there were disease outbreaks in the centers. So UNICEF with ICRC worked to evacuate 300, the remaining 300 babies and infants from that orphanage in the middle of the fighting, and very, very fragile, some of them really on the brink of death, so very fragile, to a safer place where we brought them outside of Khartoum. And have been in a process of getting those children into foster care and into families since then. Very sadly, the place we had taken them to in December also got overrun by fighting, and we had to evacuate them a second time to another safer location, where we've also just been continuously working to get them to families. But it's hard to play catch up, because just as you're getting children into foster care, there are more children for example, those born from rape that get dropped off at these institutions. So really about deinstitutionalizing this and getting children into families. But that said, the number of families and Sudanese families, even who are very stretched themselves, who have raised their hand to want to take in children and adopt, including among our own staff and across society, is also really quite inspiring at the same time.
Yeah, I've never understood why it seems somewhat acceptable for some men in conflict to think that they can rape women. But hearing what you've told us, so there's the actual rape itself, there's the massive stigmatization that woman when pregnant is going to have, and then what's inevitably going to happen to that child is just pure evil. Yeah. Thank you. Pauline, were you indicating to come in? No. David, over to you.
Thank you, Mary Louise, for that, what you've just told us, because it's a tremendous insight into just the awfulness of the situation in relation to those children. Can you just tell us the impact of the conflict on children more generally in terms of their day-to-day lives? I mean, we've heard about the malnutrition issues, but just generally in terms of their day-to-day lives.
And I think generally there's just so much trauma from this war, so much, so many scars. So children who've witnessed violence, who have been violated themselves, children who have lost everything, who have seen their friends and family members die or be killed in this process. So a lot of lasting trauma and lasting scars 1 year on. And with over 4.6 million children who fled their homes, that's a countrywide trauma of children who have endured so much loss. That's in addition to all of the health issues and the loss of life and as a result. But that said, children are extraordinarily resilient. And so getting them into safe spaces, getting them into school is such a critical thing to have normalcy in their lives, just to be children. And we've been able to, it's a drop in the ocean, unfortunately, but almost 1 million children we have gotten into these child-friendly safe spaces. We call makanas, which means our place, where they have their access to structured learning, to psychosocial support, and to wash facilities. Just in getting them into those safe spaces is, we can see the healing happening. So in the early days after fleeing, and one of the activities we do with the children is drawing art. All of the art was about soldiers and dead bodies and very, very grim pictures of what they'd been experiencing. And then just a few months on in these centers and where they can be and play and be children. Now it's rare to see those kinds of images, and we're seeing, more and more flowers and rainbows and hearts and happiness in these places. So just that safe, secure psychosocial support, such a fundamental piece in getting these schools to reopen. The drop in the ocean it's important. 900,000 children in these centers, but as I said, 18 million children not in school. The only way to reach them at scale is for schools to reopen. So we're advocating on all levels for schools to reopen wherever it's safe for them to do so. And FCDO, among many other governments in the Global Partnership for Education, are also supporting the reopening of those schools and getting children back into school if they can open their doors.
I'll come to Khalid in a moment, but just to follow up on that, I mean, is there more that the FCDO could do, or something better they could do in terms of helping facilitate what you've just set out in relation to either school or the safe places?
I want to really thank FCDO for raising that education cannot be forgotten in the midst of war and in the middle of an emergency, because often it's the last thing people think of. They think of life-saving means, let's think health, let's think nutrition, let's think food. But that security and that psychosocial, that environment for children is so important. And FCDO has been very vocal and very engaged in getting that message out. Of course, more and more support is always needed. And I just urge that education not be forgotten in this crisis, and FCDO has been very vocal about that and much appreciated.
Khalid?
Yeah, I just want to add on a positive note. We have started in this year our homegrown school feeding activities, encouraging girls back to school and providing income opportunities for women. And also, as part of the Resilient Project, we started targeting mainly women-headed households in Eastern Sudan to provide livelihood opportunities. In addition to that, in the next few months, we are planning to reach 1,300,000 children, mothers, and pregnant and breastfeeding women with nutrition food. So there is activities, but what we are asking is, in order for us to really scale up and respond to the needs, we do need to again to have a much larger access to a number of other areas and continuously. Thanks.
Thank you. Ultimately, an end to the violence is the best way to protect women and girls, the best way to prevent famine, the best way to get children back into school. And what we need to see from the UK government is a step up in diplomatic efforts to secure peace and ensuring that any peace processes that are brokered are inclusive of Sudanese civilian voices and civil society.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Sibongani, could you just talk us through how easy it is to provide aid on the ground? Is it straightforward, or are there lots of barriers and obstacles placed in your way?
It's been very difficult over the last year to provide aid in many parts of Sudan for many reasons. First and foremost, I would like to honor the unwavering strength of our Sudanese colleagues who have been on the ground and continue to work through some very, very difficult circumstances. As humanitarian responders, we are doing everything possible to contain the crisis by supporting people. But despite assurances from the authorities, from the parties to the conflict, we continue to see impediments to the delivery of life-saving assistance. These impediments include arbitrary denials of access, so permissions to move from one part of the country to another. Those are denied with no clear justification. Visas for us to send in surge staff to scale up our capacity. As I said earlier, the INGO community has over 100 visas pending with no real justification for why we're not being given those visas. We have an example of trying to move from El Fasher in North Darfur to other areas of Darfur where we asked for permission to move cross-line, and that permission was denied. So the insecurity is one side that is making it very difficult for us to work, but at the same time, there are so many bureaucratic hurdles imposed by the parties to the conflict, which mean that we are not able to reach people in a timely manner. Despite all of these challenges, we continue to push the authorities to push the authorities so that we can access people in need. And as Khalid has said so many times, what we need is an increased commitment to facilitate access by the parties to the conflict, but also the international community putting additional pressure on the authorities and the parties to the conflict for humanitarian access.
Thank you. Mary Louise, you're signaling.
I think just to try and drill down on this, on the access. So we, as I mentioned up front, we have this three-pronged approach where we look at the hotspots where there's conflict, we look at the areas where we have greater access and we have greater movement. So we have 6 offices across states in the north, east, south that are open, functioning. I travel often across the country. But what's difficult is what Sibongani was mentioning is around the cross line. So going from where one armed group to another area of control, and cross-border, where the largest cross-border and most important right now is our cross-border from Chad. So going from Chad into West Sudan, into Darfur, where we have over 5 million children at very, very high risk of malnutrition and death with this looming famine. So the cross-border Chad, we all as aid groups have had significant pipelines of life-saving supplies coming through. But about 2 months ago, that was requested to be stopped in terms of that cross-border. So we have no authority and authorization to do those cross-border movements from Chad, which is highly, highly problematic. So all efforts to unlock that Chad-Sudan cross-border humanitarian lifeline is fundamental, as well as significantly unlocking the cross line within Sudan that goes east to west to get those critical supplies in.
Thank you. Khalid?
Thank you. Allow me just to unpack the access. When we're talking about access as humanitarians, we're talking about the movement of personnel and goods. It's worth to mention that the treatments are different between UN agencies and INGOs. And this is something that we have to do a better job as the humanitarian actors here, but more importantly, also the international community, to make sure that the UN agencies and its partners, the INGOs, are treated the same way when it comes to visas and travel. Number two, on the issue of the hotspot areas where the access impediments are, is largely in the Darfurs and Kordofans. Indeed, the closure of the Adre access that we had, that Mary Louise alluded to, is a serious problem. That closure basically prevented us, the humanitarian of people. Now, the Sudanese government have closed that border, but they opened a separate cross border from the teenage Chad side, which makes it much harder assistance to reach, especially in the west of Darfur. Now, then there's the cross-line issue, whereby the areas that are outside of the control of the SAF, where it is very difficult for trucks to gain easy access because they face a road blockage, and also oftentimes they're subjected to monitoring, whereby the drivers are requested to pay money in order to be given access. Thanks. Over.
Thank you. What could the international community do? Would this be put pressure on to reopen the Chad border? Is that the most effective thing we could do? Sibongani, you signalled?
The UK and the international community need to commit to elevating and escalating diplomatic pressure to ensure that humanitarians are able to access all parts of the country, regardless of territorial control, that all entry points into Sudan are not just through Chad, but all feasible entry points, that humanitarians should be allowed to use all of those entry points, ensuring that we can reach many more people. Sudan is a very large country, and Darfur, the Darfur crossing points in and of themselves are not sufficient.
The Sudan government that's being difficult here, is it the neighbouring ones as well that are being obstructive? Maybe Louise?
I think the point of Sibongani is that it's all access points are essential. And so that concerted effort to get the parties to the table, there's something called a humanitarian forum that the parties had agreed to convene to monitor these access issues and to make sure that humanitarian corridors were open for aid. That hasn't convened. So getting the parties to the table to convene that humanitarian forum to monitor the access and to guarantee that access on all sides. So the Chad cross-border is one, the cross line across south, the southern access, if you like, within the country is another, east to west. and the northern access line east to west as well. So it's both parties plus other armed groups who are also in some of these communities that create the environment of insecurity where trucks and people cannot access.
Mary Louise, have there been any negotiated humanitarian corridors internally in Sudan?
So up until November, we did have fairly good access across the southern, if you go east to west in Sudan, across the southern states to get to Darfur and Kordofans. It's never easy. As I said earlier, we painstakingly negotiate every single movement, every truck, every person that crosses, and that time that it takes delays aid. But we have been able to get those negotiations done, get the permits in place, and move supplies. But with the escalating conflict and more politicization of aid that's been happening on both sides, those movements from east to west have been stuck. So that has slowed down. Access is getting worse, not better, in this context. So those few corridors that we had working have been very fragmented and mostly paused over the last few months, and that's why it's such a critical moment right now.
Khalid, you wanted to come back in?
Yes, thank you. I just wanted to also mention in terms of negotiations and efforts that are ongoing, it's worth to highlight that, yes, we do have the RCHC for Sudan, who one of the key champions the issue of access, especially in particular, and as a result, even though the government closed the Adre cross-border, the government agreed to open a separate cross-border, which is about 2 hours from Adre, which it's the teenage Chad cross-border is what we call it. Another point also worth highlighting is that in addition to Chad cross-border, WFP is also moving food from South Sudan into Sudan, in particular reaching the communities in the two areas. And further down, the SPLM North is also facilitating WFP trucks further into government control in the Kordofans.
Khalid, we're losing your signal quite a bit. I wonder if you could turn your camera off. Great, thank you. Let's see if that works. Because in an answer you gave earlier, you said that there was a difference between the response to the UN agencies and the NGOs when it came to sort of protections and access. I wonder if you could tell us a little bit more about what that difference is and why that is.
Yes, so I was referring to the treatment and of when we talk about access, what we're talking about the movements of personnel and goods. In the case of the INGOs, they're subjected to different rules and protocols when it comes to them gaining visa approvals, permissions, and so on. And the INGOs are the partners of the UN agencies. So my position and the position WFP and other UN agencies have been advocating and continues to advocate, and this is where the FCDO also should take part of it, to support, and is that the INGOs has to be given the same type of treatment, meaning facilitate the visas, make it easier for them and their staff to reach the populations right.
Thank you.
Travel permissions and so on.
Sibongani?
And just to add on to that point, so the difference in treatment between INGOs and UN agencies is primarily illegal because of the legal and regulatory frameworks. So the UN agencies operate under a different category from INGOs, and the operation of INGOs in Sudan is managed through what is called the General Directory of Procedures for international non-government organizations, and the UN is exempt from those procedures. So there's a regulatory framework that created that distinction in the past.
And could you give us an example, so with Mercy Corps, how you feel that difference?
So I can give a primary example in terms of registration and permission to exist in Sudan at the moment. So as an INGO, as Mercy Corps, prior to the start, or we would have to renew our registration on an annual basis, which is not the case for UN agencies because they have a diplomatic agreement with the government of Sudan and therefore exist in the country legally on a different framework than we do.
Thank you.
Mary Louise, what impact has the conflict had on your staff and those of other aid organisations, and are aid workers being targeted in this conflict?
Yes, thank you for the question. And I think, just to highlight, as others have said, just the heroic efforts of aid workers across the board, from UN, international NGOs, local NGOs, civil society, and mutual aid workers, as we're seeing with the emergency response rooms, individuals who are just helping each other in this context, and families who are helping each other. So in this context, the large majority of the 4.5 million children who fled are also being hosted by Sudanese families themselves. They're not in gathering sites. It's a smaller percentage of those who are in camps, in informal sites. It's Sudanese society that is really helping the most. That said, as I mentioned, the impact on all of our staff is the same impact for the people of Sudan. But to name some cases, and I hope, colleagues who have lost so much. We have colleagues who have lost children in childbirth from the stress of what they've experienced. That we have colleagues who've lost elderly parents from heart attacks, whether as they were evacuating or where they were going and they couldn't get access to adequate care. We have a lot of extraordinary female colleagues who have initially fled across borders with their small children and their spouses, or by themselves, who've left their children with family members or husbands and returned to Sudan to keep working with their young children being taken care of by extended family members, all very much missing their children. But as my colleague Hiba Ali said the other day when we were commemorating quite emotionally the 1 year anniversary of the start of this war, it's not a job, it's a purpose. And everyone really felt drawn to staying and delivering and to coming back and continuing to deliver in Sudan, because it's just, as you said, it's just heartbreaking and requires all efforts from across the board.
Thank you. And can I just say that thank you so much to all of you for the work that you do. It can feel incredibly lonely to be you, and you have so many people to support and to hold up and to be there for. And I know that this must take we all know that this must take a significant toll on your physical and mental health, but please know that we see you and we are so grateful for all that you're doing all the way over here. We do really, really appreciate how much you have devoted your lives to doing.
Yeah, thank you so much. And our colleague Abdul Qadir said the other day that it was great to see some attention on Sudan on the anniversary of the war on the 15th of April. But the problem is that every day is the 15th of April. Yeah. The needs are there, the tragedy is there on a daily basis, and it can't just be something that's remembered from time to time. So we really appreciate the efforts of the Select Committee to bring attention to this crisis.
Thank you.
Thank you. Chris.
Thank you, Chair. Sibongani, we've been hearing about serious breaches of international law that's been committed, and I wanted to know from you, how should the international community respond?
Thank you. We need to see continued pressure on the parties to the conflict to respect international humanitarian law and the human rights of the Sudanese people. What we have seen to date is that the parties to the conflict are comfortable to continue perpetuating these violations. We see blatant disregard for international humanitarian law, even in cases where there have been agreements to protect facilities that are used by humanitarians. We have not seen those protections being given to humanitarian facilities. We need to continue to see diplomatic pressure on the parties to the conflict to respect international humanitarian law, but also the UK and Friends of Sudan need to monitor and systematically denounce the violations of international humanitarian law.
And we often hear that sanctions are not very effective. I'm assuming you're going to say that that's the case at the moment, given the continuation of those breaches. But just specifically, how has sanctions announced by the UK and other countries has it had any effect in deterring atrocities, or are they just being completely ignored?
As a humanitarian worker, I'm not best placed to answer this question. However, and the sanctions were announced pretty recently. It's difficult to say whether they're effective just yet. We are grateful that the sanctions included an exemption for humanitarian organizations, which exempt activities necessary for the delivery of humanitarian assistance. So we continue to encourage the UK government to monitor closely and ensure a dialogue with organizations working in Sudan to ensure that the sanctions do not adversely affect the capacity of humanitarian organizations to deliver assistance.
And yeah, I was just about to ask either Khalid or Mary Louise, maybe have something you'd like to say on this.
No, I think Sibongani put it really well, but I think it's just the evidence from similar crises around the world has shown that the most effective sanctions are those against individuals rather than, companies or shell companies and groups, and that's where the needle can be pushed a little further. So the targeted sanctions on individuals rather than has just historically proven to be more effective.
Thank you, Jeff.
Yeah, Khalid.
Oh, sorry, Khalid.
No, I was just going to say, I think political solutions are imperative to resolving the crisis. The UK's commitment to promoting accountability and protecting civilians in conflict-affected areas is greatly appreciated. But I think we need also additional diplomatic efforts to ensure that all parties uphold international humanitarian law, facilitate human a space for aid agencies to operate effectively.
Oh, Kelly.
We lost you a little bit there.
We lost you a little bit. I think we might need to ask you just to go to, yeah, there you go. Thank you.
No, lastly, I was saying that diplomatic humanitarian law, facilitate humanitarian access, but also create space for aid agencies to operate effectively. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Nigel, could I turn to you, please?
Yes, of course. I mean, I think the conflict in Sudan has been called the forgotten conflict. Why do you think the crisis has not had the attention it should have had from the international community? Is it just because there's too much else happening in the world, or is there some other reason you think why we've not focused on this? Mary Louise, please.
I think there are many reasons, and one you've mentioned. There is a lot going on, and but related to that and compounding it has been that a few things. The telecoms in the country, there have been blackouts, so getting information out of Sudan and reaching people in Sudan has been very, very difficult. And the telecoms thing, just to say, has impacted communities across the board. So even the capacity of families to access support from their families overseas in the diaspora, et cetera, or across the country not having access to the cell phone network has been a significant issue for communities. So telecoms access is a point, I think, of advocacy that is very important to be pushing on, and making sure that the two main companies the three companies, one has almost folded, I believe now, but the two remaining ones are able to maintain operations is really fundamental and life-saving. So that is one. I think also international journalists and media initially were really struggling to get visas into the country. I understand that some of those visas have been forthcoming, and so there's a little bit more movement of international media into Sudan, but much, much more is needed to really show the reality on the ground and the suffering of Sudanese children and women among all of society.
Thank you. Sibongani.
To add on to what Mary Louise said, I think there is also a denial of the fact that what we are seeing in Sudan is not just about Sudan. It affects the entire region from the Red Sea to the Sahel. And what we are going to see, or what we might see if the situation is not contained, is a destabilization into other countries. We know there are elections, for example, in South Sudan and Chad in the next few months, but also as populations continue to move outside of Sudan, they're placing strain on already constrained countries, which is going to further destabilize the region. So the sooner we spread that message that this is a regional crisis and not just about Sudan, possibly we can get more attention, but we need to drive home that message and bring more attention to the region as a whole, and how what is happening in Sudan can further destabilize the region.
Thank you. How would you assess the response of the UK government? Have we done everything we could have done, or do you think there's more we should be doing? On Sibongani, we'll stay with you.
Thank you. The UK government has been very supportive since the start of this process. We've seen dedicated funding for Sudan, which has been doubled in the last year to 89 million. We've also seen the UK clearly articulating what the priorities are. However, despite the good work that is being done, there is always room for improvement. It's said the only room that's never full is the room for improvement. So there is additional work that can be done by the UK government. So around scaling up diplomatic and humanitarian efforts to support actors on the ground by advocating for access, using the UK as the pen holder on Sudan, advocating for the monitoring on those violations of international humanitarian law, and continuing to support a peaceful and sustainable political solution to the conflict. But Mary Louise also had her hand up, so I'll hand over to her.
Thank you.
You said it perfectly, Sibongani. I think just to add a concerted, coordinated effort to get the two parties to the table in negotiations. And we hear, that Jeddah is reopening and in the next few weeks, but that effort needs to be all hands on deck. And the UK is a key actor in that, and in the Security Council. For one, the humanitarian corridors that are urgent and critical, and two, getting those parties to the table to stop the war.
Khalid, any observations on this?
No further comments from my side. I think it was well said by both colleagues, Sibongani and Mary Louise. Thank you.
Mary, just finally, was the UK right to have held discussions with the Rapid Support Forces, or was that a mistake, do you think?
So as UNICEF, we speak to all parties to ensure that we can get aid to children, and that and it's so important to talk about violations, to talk to the parties in conflict to ensure that international humanitarian law is being respected and the populations are being protected. So in that sense, it's important to speak to all sides in order to get a solution to this war. It's not possible to reach communities, to reach children, to get aid and to get a solution without speaking to all parties in the conflict.
Thank you. Just finally, which country do you think is most influential with the various parties? Who do you think is best placed to move this forward?
I think that certainly the Security Council and the regional actors, so the neighboring countries, the regional actors, and then at the wider level on the Security Council, very, very important. So I will defer to, there are alliances and support coming from different countries to different groups, and it's and those are known.
Thank you.
Thank you. Sibongani, at the beginning you told us about the extent of the internally and externally displaced people. I wonder, and I direct this to Khalid, do neighbouring countries receiving refugees have the capacity and resources to host them?
Hi. The largest refugees so far, let me turn on the video actually. The largest refugees to date recorded to Chad, then South Sudan, of Sudanese refugees. And I can tell you that the demands, then the ability of the World Food Program to respond to and meet the needs of these refugees. More support is definitely urgently needed. And as you recall, His Excellency, the Deputy Foreign Secretary, Andrew Mitchell, recently visited the Adjur refugee, where WFP is providing there. And the situation there is completely devastating. And we're hoping that FCDO and other partners will step up support in order for the collective colleagues to ensure they have the funding necessary to meet the needs of these refugees.
And are you seeing any coordination of all of the countries impacted, or are they each being dealt with individually by donors?
There is absolutely a coordinated discussions in place. In fact, recently there was the regional director of WFP overseeing these three countries was actually in London briefing the FC colleagues. So the coordination is ongoing, and we hope and pray that more support will come their way. Thank you.
That's great, thank you. And Sibongani, I wonder what impact is the conflict having on the stability of those neighbouring countries?
Thank you. So when we look at the numbers of displacement across the region, we're seeing extremely high numbers going into South Sudan and Chad, as Khalid already said. And it is important to note that on the 15th of February, 2024, the government of Chad announced an emergency situation with regard to food security. And then also in South Sudan, independently of the refugees who have returned from Sudan into South Sudan and the Sudanese refugees now entering South Sudan on its own had 7 million people facing severe food insecurity. So a very, very difficult situation in those countries. And what we need to see is really a coordinated effort to fund the countries that are hosting these refugees appropriately. So the funding that we need to see is for Sudan, but also for the neighboring countries that are hosting these large populations.
Thank you. David.
Mary Louise, you referenced the Paris conference a little earlier and the UK's increased contribution. But do you think that the conference overall raised sufficient funds to meet Sudan's humanitarian needs?
No, it didn't. So there were pledges about $2 billion, which is less than half of the need just for within Sudan. But those $2 billion of pledges were for Sudan, were for neighboring countries. And so within Sudan, we haven't done all the math on all of the pledges and all of the calculations, but our estimates is that might reach 1/3, if that, of the critical need within Sudan of the populations here.
Sibongani?
And just to add on to what Mary Louise has said, when we think of that 2.1 billion, it represents only 20 cents per day per person for each person facing urgent needs in Sudan and in neighboring countries. So whilst we welcome the announcement of these funds, and they will help us to scale up, we need much, much more and to fill the envelope that is needed for Sudan and neighboring countries.
Thank you.
Thank you. Final question from me.
Khalid,
sorry.
did you want to say something? Sorry.
Yeah, I just the underfunding and limited the underfunding in addition to the access problem here in Sudan, the overall needs are rising by the day, and indeed, as the colleagues mentioned, more and more support is needed in order to prevent famine-like situations in Sudan.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you. Khalid, I take your point that underfunding and humanitarian access points are crucial. Well, full funding and access points are crucial, but it seems to me that unless the conflict stops, all of this becomes somewhat pointless. So I wonder if any of you will be able to comment on what more the international community could be doing to bring this conflict to an end, or if that's out of your remit. Please, Sibongani.
I'm happy to open on this one. So what we need to see from the international community is continued commitment to supporting a peaceful, inclusive, and sustainable resolution to the conflict. And this process must meaningfully, the key word is meaningfully, include women, youth, and civil society voices in the process. Specifically for the UK government, the ask would be that the UK continues to utilize their position as a pen holder on Sudan at the UN Security Council to increase the international spotlight on the atrocities in Sudan and to pressure the concerned parties to end the fighting.
Beautifully put. Thank you very much. I really appreciate the time that all of you have taken today. It's horrifying to hear what you, your colleagues, and the people of Sudan are going through as a consequence of this conflict, and I absolutely hope, Sibongani, I think that was a powerful way to end about that peaceful and inclusive resolution to conflict that meaningfully engages particularly women and young people. Thank you for sharing your thoughts. We will do all that we can to amplify what you have told us. I appreciate your time again, and please, send my solidarity to your colleagues. Order. This session is now closed.
The proceeding has ended.